on, guys? The Comics Kid 2099. Welcome to day 123 of the 365-day graphic novel review challenge. Today, I want to talk to you about another sword and sorcery character like I've been doing for the last few weeks, but this is a very different kind of sword and sorcery character. Today, I want to be talking about Solomon Kane in the Saga of Solomon Kane. This printing is from Dark Horse Comics, but the material that's collected inside was originally done by Marvel Comics. Most of the stuff here was backup stories from the Savage Sword of Conan magazine that was done by Marvel in the 70s on up until the 90s. And most of this is from that, but there's a couple that are from like Marvel Premiere or Marvel 2-in-1, something like that. Some of those other anthology books from the 70s. And this is about the character Solomon Kane, who you are probably familiar with if you are a pretty huge fan of Conan or Cole or any of Robert E. Howard's other characters. But this is a very different kind of character than any of those others that Robert E. Howard created. Conan and Cole, they both exist in a time period that doesn't really exist in reality. There was no Cimmeria, there probably was no Atlantis, or if there was, it was absolutely nothing like the Atlantis of Legends. Pretty much every nation and kingdom in the Conan and Cole stories by Robert E. Howard, those are completely 100% made up. And as such, Robert E. Howard was able to be a lot more inventive and be a lot more creative in what he was allowed to do in those stories. Solomon Kane is different because there is a fantastical element to the character and most of the stories in this book, but it's constrained by reality. Solomon Kane is a Puritan who lives in the 1500s. That is a real time period. There were actually Puritans. We get to see Solomon Kane meet real people who actually existed in this time period, like Francis Drake. He shows up in one of these stories. Richard Greenville, he was another sailor from that time period. So we get to see Solomon Kane interact with the real world, and as such, that's a very different kind of story that you're not going to get with Conan or Cole, and I found that to be very refreshing after mostly being familiar with Conan and Cole stories from Robert E. Howard, and even stories that are not by Robert E. Howard, because a lot of this book is adaptations of stories that he wrote, but some of these are brand new stories created by other people who are working in the comic book industry. And let me just go ahead and talk about that. What's really interesting about this book, because it is so huge, a lot of these are adapted from Robert E. Howard stories, like I said, but a lot of these stories are done by different creators. There is no consistent writer or consistent artist. There are many of both. And so while there is a tonal consistency, it's also just different enough in each story that you get to see, well, here's what Roy Thomas would do with a Solomon Kane story, and here's what Don Glut would do with a Solomon Kane story. And then you get to see like what Neil Adams would do drawing Solomon Kane and different things like that. And that's really interesting to me. Now, I know I've talked about before how whenever I'm reading a trade paperback that I prefer it to have one single writer and one single artist throughout the whole thing. That's mostly when it's one story. If it's a 6-part story being collected in trade, I would prefer the entire story to be written by one person and drawn by one person. But since this is like 30 different stories, I'm okay with having different artists and different writers coming in and doing their own thing with this character and this world. Another thing that I thought was very interesting about this compared to Conan and Cole is that most of the time, it seems to me that Conan, you could just drop in at any point in his life and just tell another story. Maybe he's a pirate, maybe he's a soldier, maybe he's a king, maybe he's a thief. There's different areas of his life where you could tell any kind of story that you want. With this book, it seemed like there was much more effort to create a definitive Solomon Kane timeline. And so at the beginning of many of these stories, they would say there's a certain point in Solomon Kane's life where he was in Africa and this takes place right after that, or something like that. And maybe it sounds similar to the Conan thing, but it seems like there was more of an effort to not just say, okay, we're just going to drop in at this point in Solomon Kane's life and we can just do whatever we want. It seems to me that Robert E. Howard and also the people telling these stories, that they were actually trying to create a timeline of events for Solomon Kane, and they were actually trying to stick to that timeline. And so that's interesting to me when I'm so familiar with how things were done with the Conan stories that I've read. Also, this book, about 2/3 of it is stuff from the late 70s and early 80s. I think the earliest story here is from 1977, I think. And then, like I said, the first 2/3 of it goes up to about 1981 or so. And most of those stories, there's some sort of continuity between them where he will get a magic staff from this one guy in Africa in one story, and then that staff will show up in another story. And then he will mention something that happened to him in one story, and then that will come back into play later. And then around 1981, 1982, I'm guessing the Solomon Kane stories just stopped being published in the Savage Sword of Conan book, because after that, we get a few more stories, but there's like years in between those stories. We get one from like 1981, and then we'll jump forward to like 1984, and then 1989. The latest story in this book is from 1994. So there's almost 20 years in between the first story and the last story of this book, but there's not 20 consistent years of comics here featuring Solomon Kane, if that makes any sense. But we get one issue in the last third of this book where we get to see Solomon Kane as an old man, and that was very sombering. I talked about the other day how I don't think Conan the Barbarian is ever going to get a happy ending. I also don't think that Solomon Kane is going to get a happy ending, but I think his sad ending is very different from Conan's. I imagine Conan is going to die in battle, although maybe not. Solomon Kane, I can see him just withering away and dying of old age, and everybody is kind of like, who's that guy over there? Like, they have this idea that maybe he was important once upon a time, but that was a really long time ago, and nobody really knows who he is or what all he's done for the world. I kind of imagine Solomon Kane ending like that, and we get just a hint of that in a couple of these stories where he's significantly older than he was in the rest of the stories. And then we also get a story where he teams up with Conan the Barbarian. And that might sound really stupid, and at first when I saw the cover of that issue, I was thinking, I don't know about this. But it worked pretty well, and it also references a lot of the stuff that happens in these other Solomon Kane stories. But I really like this book. If you are a huge fan of some of Robert E. Howard's other characters, like Conan and Cole, basically. Those are the only two that I really know of. But you don't know anything about Solomon Kane, I would definitely check out the Saga of Solomon Kane. I think it's very much worth your time. I really enjoyed this. I definitely don't regret this at all. I think that this is something that I wish there was more Solomon Kane to read. But other than like news stories, speaking of, check out what I'm going to be doing tomorrow, hint hint. But other than like very news stories from Dark Horse, there's not really a whole lot of Solomon Kane out there to read. There's this, and then there's roughly 300 pages of prose stories that are actually by Robert E. Howard. I think in the mid-90s, shortly after the last story in this book, there was a collection of all of the Robert E. Howard Solomon Kane stories. So there's not a whole lot of Solomon Kane out there to read compared to Conan, where there's just tons and tons and tons of it. But I definitely recommend this if you have heard of this character, but you've never actually read anything with him, or you're a big fan of some of the other Robert E. Howard characters, but you've never heard of this and you've never read any of this. I would definitely recommend that you read this. I don't think that you will be disappointed. So that's my thoughts on the Saga of Solomon Kane. I hope that you guys liked this video, and if you did, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe. And like I said, I'll be back tomorrow to talk about another Solomon Kane book. Which will it be? Who knows? I know. Anyway, I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a great rest of the day. Catch you later.